Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jordan and thank you so much for clicking on one of my bookish videos. Today I am so excited because I am going to be talking about 15 fantasy books that are actually worth reading this fall and honestly any time of year. We are now getting into the middle of August, which for me is the time of year where I start to really feel pulled to get back into my fantasy era and pick up some of the books on my fantasy TBR, and I wanted to share some of my all-time favorite fantasy and romantasy series and books for you to add to your TBR. So if you're interested in hearing about 15 fantasy series that I think is worth reading, then keep on watching. Okay, so we have to start off this video with my favorite fantasy series of all time. It only feels right, and that is the Legendborn Cycle series by Tracy Deonn. This is a young adult fantasy series that I would say also has a bit of dark academia in a way because it's set at a university. And this book is probably the most unique fantasy world that I've ever read. It just has a very unique magic system and fantasy setting. It is following the main character, Bree, who is a young teenage girl who is going to the University of North Carolina early as part of like an early college program. When she gets there, she kind of falls into this world of King Arthur and his knights, a magic system and a fantasy world based off of that like myth. She finds herself in the middle of this secret society full of very powerful magical people that she does not really fit in with, and all of a sudden she finds herself kind of at the front and becoming one of the most powerful figures within the secret society. I love everything about this series. Right now there's only 3 books out. Bree is one of my favorite female main characters of all time. She is so badass but also really complex in the way that she's dealing with a lot of grief and emotions as a young female teenager, and the love triangle in this book is so good. Like one where I cannot choose honestly between either of the 2 male main character love interests, and there's really cool ancestral and black generational magic and history being passed on through Bree, which is really cool. So this is a series that you must add to your list if you have not read it yet this fall. Next, we have another young adult fantasy series that I think about constantly. I read this series around this time last summer and absolutely became obsessed with it, and that is An Ember in the Ashes by Saba Tahir. This series was gifted to me by Penguin Teen, so thank you very much to them. I am obsessed with Saba Tahir's writing, and this is her first like big fantasy series set in this world. It follows Leia and Ilias, and Leia is a slave in this empire and Ilias is one of like the soldiers. And so in this book, Leia essentially is dealing with a lot of issues in her family, and she decides to become a spy to try and spy on the empire and seek justice for her family. And she sneaks into the empire as a slave trying to be a spy for the revolution, and she comes across a lot of hidden secrets. Honestly, my favorite thing about this book is not only the characters, they all are so complex and so fun to read about, but I love the empire and the fantasy world and just the tones and themes of this book. It focuses a lot about different injustices and colonialism and empires and the effects that has on all of the people within the empires. Helene, who we get introduced to in this first book and follows as one of the main characters, is like one of my favorite female main characters of all time. Next, we have one of my new recent fantasy favorites from one of my favorite fantasy authors, and that is Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab. This is my favorite book of the year. By now, everyone has heard me talk about how much I love this book, but this is fantasy because it is following 3 lesbian vampires who are all female characters that were turned into vampires at different points throughout history. So we're following following Sabine, Lottie, and Alice. And Sabine is the first turned vampire. She lives, I believe, in the 1800s. And throughout the story, she kind of continues on and leaves a path of dead bodies and lost lovers in her wake as she lives through all these different centuries and comes across Lottie and Alice and leaves her mark. It is just such a fun book to read, but also so deeply emotional, and the writing in this is so beautiful, and it is so perfect to read during the fall. I will definitely be rereading this for the third time this fall. Next, we have a favorite fantasy series of mine from one of my favorite authors, and that is the Poppy War series by R.F. Kong. This also beautiful special edition my best friend Sarah got me, and I'm so obsessed with it. I read this series last year, and honestly, I've really been craving a reread because this is a fantasy series, like epic fantasy, not really romantasy, and the world that R.F. Kong built in this series and the horror, gory realness of what the people in this empire go through was so realistic. So this book follows Rin, and she is an orphan who is living in this empire that has gone through 2 different poppy wars, and everyone basically is living in fear of a third poppy war occurring between the Nikara Empire and then the Federation. And in this book, Rin basically aces this empire test, becomes one of the most like talented people that's being pursued by this academy in the empire. And Rin is someone who goes through very, very terrible things throughout this series. But again, the themes of Rin being an orphan, being a dark-skinned person who came from poverty, her dynamic as she makes her way up through the ranks in the empire because of her talent and her academic wit is so fascinating. This is definitely a very dark series, but I think is one of the most well done epic fantasy series out there. Okay, next we have another series that I read exactly this time at the end of last summer going into last fall and became obsessed with. And when I tell you I've been craving a reread of this series so badly, who knows if it's going to happen this fall. That is the Belladonna series by Adeline Grace. This is a romantasy series that definitely leans like very gothic and dark fantasy in that it's in a very like gothic setting. So this series is basically these mortal female main characters that meet and interact with and fall in love with these gods. And in the first book, Belladonna, Signa meets death and is kind of in a world where death is always appearing to her whenever she eats these belladonna berries, and it's just like a constant presence in her life. It is just gothic fantasy and romantasy perfection. Like, I had so much fun reading this series. I honestly think that each book got better and better. I think that Wisteria, the third book, ended up being my favorite with Blythe, and the audiobooks are absolutely so well narrated. They were so much fun to listen to, so I highly recommend listening to them if you enjoy audiobooks. Reread in my future. Okay, speaking of another romantasy series that I love, we have the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy by Stephanie Garber. I read this series probably now either 2 or 3 years ago. I still hold a very special place in my heart for this series. This is following Evangeline and Jax, and it is set in the broader Caravel universe, which is her other young adult series. So I do recommend reading that series before this if you want like the full effect and seeing Jax in that series, then be a main character in this one. In this book, it's very much like a fairy tale setting, which I think is very cool. And Evangeline is someone who has always believed in true love and happily ever afters, and she is determined to to have that life for herself. And then she finds out that the love of her life is marrying someone else. And so she strikes a deal with Jax, who is the Prince of Hearts, to stop that wedding from happening because she believes that's the love of her life. And she starts bargaining with Jax and gets herself mixed up into a very difficult situation throughout this series with the Prince of Hearts and potentially a little romance. I love Evangeline's character. I think she's just so fun and whimsical, but she also is so pure-hearted and believes so deeply in the power of love. And Jax is one of my favorite male main characters in a fantasy series of all time. Next, we have the Stormlight Archive series by Brandon Sanderson. This series was gifted to me by Tor Books, so thank you very much to them. This series intimidated me for so long because of the length. Right now there are 5 books out, and it's the first 5 books in what's going to be a 10-book series, and each book is this long or longer. But let me tell you, if you like epic fantasy and want a series to just become completely immersed in and obsessed with, this is your series. It was the most fun ever reading this series throughout the past year. I really took my time with it to soak it all up because it is jam-packed with backstories and character arcs, character developments, and the overarching arc of what is occurring. It is basically set in this world in the Cosmere where there are all these different groups of people. There are the heralds, who are like these old gods that were essentially abandoning the people. Then there's the Knights Radiant, who are these groups of people that have like very strong magical powers. And in this first book especially, we are following Kaladin, who is my favorite character, as he is peeling himself up from a really dark place in his life. He has lost his brother, he has become a slave, he is just very down in the dumps, and he starts to gain these powers and become this really respected and powerful figure in the kingdom as he is working with his Bridge 4 men. It's kind of hard to explain this series, but basically it follows this huge cast of characters, and each character is intertwined with the other. And in this first book, you see a few different perspectives that eventually all kind of come together. Their stories mesh together throughout the series. I cannot recommend this series enough. I think it is so much fun, and I just love the characters so much. Okay, I have to give a shout out to one of my favorite older YA fantasy series, and that is the Shadowhunters universe. And specifically, I have Lady Midnight, which is part of the 3rd trilogy. So the Shadowhunters universe is a series that has been ongoing literally since I was a kid. It started with the Mortal Instruments, and there's a 5-book series there, and then it goes into the Infernal Devices series, and then the Dark Artifices, and then the Last Hours, and it is still continuing to this day. I love this universe because each mini series within it follows a different group of characters, but they all are related in that they're set in different decades and generations and different locations. And throughout the series, as the books go on, you get to see different generations of these families, and it basically follows all these different magical beings. You have the Shadowhunters, who are like descended from the angels, and they have these magical abilities and are set and tasked to ensure that humans are kept safe from the different more evil magical creatures. You have vampires, you have werewolves, you have demons, and just a bunch of really wonderful characters that get up to crazy adventures throughout this universe. You have really amazing romances between a lot of the main characters. It feels so nostalgic, and it's also just so fun as it continues on, and we get to see descendants of the first series main characters and follow them in their adventures. Okay, next I have a recent favorite that I have to give a shout out to, and that is Immortal Consequences by Ivy Marie. This book literally just released, and it is blowing up. I had a few friends that know Ivy Marie and have followed her for a while that told me that that this book was going to be the next big thing, and they were right. It's been out for like a week and a half, and it's already New York Times bestseller, US Today bestseller. It is 100% worth those accolades because I had the most fun time reading this book. So basically, it is set in essentially the afterlife, and it's following these 6 main characters that go to Blackwood Academy. So it's very much a dark academia fantasy book, and these 6 main characters are at the academy where every couple of years they have to participate in the decennial competition, and they basically get stuck in the midst of this trial as they fight to the death for one of them to become either part of the Ascended, which is like the professors at the school. They get to live forever in the afterlife and teach the students who come in after they die how to help others pass on, or they can choose to forget their past life and just completely move on themselves and not be stuck in like the in-between. I absolutely loved it. It gave me the Atlas 6 vibes a bit in terms of dark academia and these 6 magical main characters and like how deeply complex and a bit flawed and maybe morally gray some of them are. I loved August and Ren, who are 2 of the main characters, and their banter and relationship. Same with Emilio and Oliver. It just was so much fun. This is definitely going to be a huge series, and if you were looking for dark academia, young adult, a little bit of romantasy with beautiful, beautiful writing about grief and loss, I highly recommend this. Okay, next I have to give a shout out to Babel by R.F. Kong. I read this about 2 years ago now, and I think it is still my favorite book by her. It is a dark academia typed fantasy and is one of the most unique books I've ever read. So basically, it is following Robin, who is a character who is a Chinese boy. He was raised in Britain, and he is very, very intelligent and is pursuing a degree at Oxford. And so he wants to enroll in Oxford's Royal Institute of Translation, which is known as Babel, this like tower. The tower is responsible for translating all of the world's languages and magic. It's hard to explain, but the magic system is based in silver and silver working, and it's basically manifesting the meaning lost in translation between these languages using silver bars. And it's how Britain has become so powerful as an empire throughout the years. So honestly, this is very much like a historical epic fantasy, and it really centers around colonialism, the British Empire, the power of language and translation, and those who are able to understand languages and how they become the most powerful, as well as greed and racism. It is just so well done. Like, it is a masterpiece. It is something that you definitely need to soak up, but once you read it, I promise you, you will not stop thinking about it for a very long time. Okay, next we also have a recent favorite, although this series has been out for a while, and that is the Kindred Curses series, The Spark of the Everflame as the first book. This book was gifted to me by Atria Books, so thank you very much to them. I have heard a lot about how this book blew up on Book Talk and became a huge thing in the romantasy genre, and I have heard friends that have read the series and enjoyed it but not been totally blown away by it. I am obsessed. I read this over the summer when I was just feeling very bored with a lot of the same romantasy over and over again, and I'm not gonna lie, this is very much a standard romantasy book. It follows Diem, who lives in a world of the old gods, and she is immortal. She has always had these like weird abilities and been a bit different from the other mortals, and in this first book, her mother goes missing, who was a healer for the king, who is the king of the descended, which are those who are descended from the gods. They have magic powers, and she has to start taking over for her mother as the healer, where she begins interacting with Prince Luther, who is one of the most powerful of the descendants. Throughout her interaction with him, there's a lot of foreshadowing of the type of power that Diem actually has. But listen, Something about this series, and I think specifically the romance in it, is something that has me gripped. Like, I could not stop reading this book or the second book. I'm about to start reading the third book, and I'm so excited. Diem and Luther's relationship, and especially in the first two books, the tension and the angst between them, as you clearly can tell that they have a lot of feelings about each other, is so, so good. And personally, I really enjoyed Diem's character. I think she's someone who is bogged down by a lot of loss and trauma of losing her family and not knowing her true heritage and who her true parents are. And she is someone who comes into a lot of responsibility at a really young age. And yeah, if you want like a fast-paced, amazing romantasy series, I really recommend this one. Next, I have to give a special shout out to One for My Enemy by Olivia Blake. Olivia is one of my favorite authors ever, and I think a lot of her books lean fantasy or like dark academia, but they don't fully fit in the genre. This, I think, is her most fantasy-ish book, along with Masters of Death, but this is my personal favorite, and this is her Romeo and Juliet retelling. It follows two witch families living in New York on like two different sides of this blood feud. Is just so much fun. It's like take Romeo and Juliet but put it in a witchy magical setting in very Olivia Blake flawed, morally gray again characters. I just had the best time reading it. So you have the Antonova sisters and the Antonova family and their mother, who is the witch Baba Yaga, and then you have the Fedorov brothers who serve their crime boss father, and we have the, star-crossed lovers of the sisters and the brothers, and just the tension between these two families is so much fun. All right, and the final book is another Romeo and Juliet retelling, and that is These Violent Delights and the Secret Shanghai duology, which is this series by Chloe Gong. This was my introduction to Chloe Gong and is what made me fall in love with her writing and her romantasy and fantasy stories. This is such a fun way to take the story of Romeo and Juliet and blend it into a whole different setting. It's set in the 1920s in Shanghai, and it follows Juliet and Roma, who are the descendants, heirs of these two different gang groups and two different families, and they have always hated each other. They've always been in the middle of this huge feud and rivalry between the gangs and their territories. They've always kind of hated each other in a loving way, and throughout this duology, you basically get to see the two of them work to rise in power and become the heirs in their family in the middle of a big epidemic and monster who is taking over the city. So they're also trying to work out the mystery of what's going on with that. It is just star-crossed lovers in the best way. I love her writing in this, and Juliet and Roma are two of my favorite romantasy characters. Okay, so that is it for this little fantasy book recommendation video. So now you have 15 fantasy, romantasy, epic fantasy series to check out and hopefully add to your TBR if you haven't read them already. These are like my beloved fantasy series that I think will always hold a very special place in my heart. Ones that kind of got me into the genre, and recent ones I've found that I have really loved. So hopefully you enjoyed watching this video. Like I said, feeling the fall fantasy vibes hardcore right now, and I cannot wait to keep making content and recommendation videos in the future. So thank you so much for watching. I would love it if you subscribe, help me get to 1,000 subscribers, and stick around for more bookish videos from me, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.